Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the fourth installment of the Bill of Rights Institute's AP preparation webinars. I'm Tom Richey, and I will be leading you in APUSH preparation tonight. Now, our topic for this one is going to be early national America. Okay, so last time we were talking about the Constitution and the in the Articles of Confederation. So in this one, I'm going to open it up for questions and kind of see what what is on your minds as far as this period between the ratification of the Constitution and the election of Thomas Jefferson as president in 1800. Now, we can go a little bit into the Jefferson presidency. That's fine as well. Okay, so whatever kinds of questions y'all have got, go ahead and put these out there. Okay, now as far as that goes, it looks like we're still in the middle of the uncertainty of the whole situation, where we're waiting on that announcement from the College Board on Friday, April 3rd. Okay, so that's something that we are eagerly waiting on, and we will see what what happens when we receive that. Now, at the same time, we don't know exactly what they're going to say here, but we'll just kind of be ready for anything. And as y'all are saying in the chat, that the DBQ is not likely. It's not likely that we're going to see it's not likely we're going to see a DBQ, but we could see LEQ, SAQs, and see where it goes from there. But the best thing for us to do right now is to look at the content, because we know what content's going to be on the exam. We know that anything between colonial America and World War II will work. Now, yes, exactly, the Jefferson versus Hamilton. Now, of course, some of y'all have seen the musical, and y'all are like, oh, Hamilton, of course, because there's the Hamilton musical. But then again, Jefferson doesn't have a musical, but I kind of like the guy. And so going from there, let's go ahead and take a look here and go into Jefferson versus Hamilton. Not necessarily a musical. I'm not going to sing for you or anything like that, but we'll go ahead and get into it. Okay, so let's go ahead and pull that up. And we're going to be looking at the first two-party system. Okay, the first two-party system, and going from there. Let's see. Let me go ahead and share my screen here. All right, so Jefferson versus Hamilton, this first two-party system. So with that, this is from 1791 to 1816. So a few years, it's not really immediately apparent, okay? It's not really immediately apparent. Remember, the Constitution never mentions political parties. So it's not, it's not that it was inevitable. And if we think about republicanism, okay, republicanism is not supposed to encourage the building of factions. In fact, if you've already taken AP government, a lot of y'all take AP government next year, that when we look at Federalist 10, we look at that, this government was supposed to, like the Constitution was supposed to tone down factions, okay, factions within the government. And so going from there, we see that this is the Federalist Party. Let me make sure my window's not in the way here. The Federalist Party, led by Alexander Hamilton, and the Jeffersonian Republican Party. Now, note that your exam may refer to this party as the Democratic Republican Party, or at the time was just referred to as the Republican Party. And so, but we don't want to confuse that with the Republican Party that was started in the 1850s that elected Abraham Lincoln as president. Okay, so make sure, whether you call it the Jeffersonian Republican Party or the Democratic Republican Party, just understand that that's going to be the same party here. Okay, and so going from there, we look at the first two-party system, and this graphic organizer, I think, is very useful here for, kind of getting this into perspective. Why is it that we start to see people moving back and forth and creating what is the equivalent of permanent political alliances in the United States government? Now, as far as that goes, remember that George Washington and Washington's farewell address, which I believe next time we're going to be focusing on foreign policy, kind of a foreign policy review from start to World War II. Okay. So when we look at the first two-party system, we've got to think about, George Washington warned us of two things, or actually several things, but the two things he warned about most that are most likely to be on your exam are that Washington it was warning Americans about permanent alliances, okay, like with other countries, basically that the United States should pursue an independent foreign policy and should not, excuse me, I got the hiccups here, should not be drawn into European wars. Okay, now this is something that continues to reverberate through American foreign policy all the way to World War II. And I think that now that the Cold War's been over for about 20 years or so, we're seeing that get back into our foreign policy a little bit. And then the other thing that George Washington warned everyone about was political parties. And when you think about this, political parties are domestically very similar to what we see as far as alliances on the international stage. So the Federalist Party, led by Alexander Hamilton. Okay, so Alexander Hamilton and also John Adams. All right, now whereas Jefferson and Madison are the initial leaders of the Republican Party. Now, note here what's interesting. You might remember, I'm going to go ahead and ask y'all who were the three people who wrote the Federalist Papers. Give you a second to think about that. And if you said James Madison, Alexander Hamilton, and John Jay, you are correct. Okay. Now, the thing is that James Madison and Alexander Hamilton cooperated in order to write the Federalist Papers. But after the Federalist Papers, were written and the Constitution was ratified, you see that Hamilton and Madison are going in different directions. So, for example, Hamilton wrote Federalist 84, where he said, we don't need a Bill of Rights. Okay, that's just, no, we don't need a Bill of Rights. And then Madison actually, when he saw that that was the only way the Constitution would be ratified, Madison, made this compromise. And during the first session of Congress under the Constitution, Madison introduced the Bill of Rights, actually introduced 12, different amendments to the Constitution, and 11 of those eventually became part of the Constitution. 10 of them immediately, and then our most recent amendment to the Constitution, the 27th Amendment, which governs congressional pay raises. That was something that was one of Madison's original proposals, but it didn't become part of the Constitution until, well, in my own lifetime, before y'all were born, but in my lifetime. And so with that, we see that Madison and Hamilton both supported the Constitution, but at the same time, they had different interpretations of how it should be brought about. Okay. So when we look at federalism, okay, we see that, that the Federalists favored a strong central government, whereas the Republicans favored states' rights. And then as far as their fears, now all of this runs together, okay? So when we think about this, why do the Federalists want a strong central government? Well, the Federalists, more than anything else, are afraid of anarchy. They're afraid of mob rule. And the Jeffersonians, they are afraid of tyranny. So you can understand why, Hamilton and the Federalists, a strong central government is the best way to prevent anarchy and mob rule. Whereas states' rights, in the views of Jefferson and Madison, that is going to be the surest way to keep this federal government from becoming a tyranny. And then when we look at the Constitution, now I typically won't use Comic Sans, but I think when you're thinking about Hamilton's approach to the Constitution, that it is appropriate here. When we think in terms of loose construction, Hamilton kind of plays it a little loose with the Constitution. And of course, the first showdown between Jefferson and Hamilton on the Constitution is over whether it has the power for the federal government to create a national bank. Okay, a national bank is never mentioned in the Constitution, and Jefferson was a strict constructionist. Madison tended to be as well, maybe not quite so strict as Jefferson, but Madison was pretty strict as well. And Jefferson, in his view, he says, look, it's not the Constitution. Constitution never says in Article 1, Section 8 that the government has the ability to charter a national bank. And so then, as far as Hamilton says, look, the necessary and proper clause. Now, this is what's interesting about this necessary and proper clause, sometimes known as the elastic clause, because it allows the Constitution to stretch a little bit. Then Hamilton says, well, look, I mean, the federal government can coin money, the federal government can tax, the federal government can collect debts, can pay, can accumulate debt, it can pay down the debt. There are a lot of these powers that having a national bank would be useful for exercising. And so when Hamilton thinks about necessary and proper, Hamilton's thinking in terms of proper. It's not immoral. It doesn't go against the powers. It complements the powers that are expressly delegated. So Hamilton doesn't see a problem with it. Now, when Jefferson looks at the necessary and proper clause, Jefferson tends to emphasize necessary. Is it necessary to have this national bank? And so then we look at their support base. Okay, what we want to note here is that Hamilton, tended to be supported in, by the urban, like coastal, commercial types, people who were engaged in trade and finance. Now, the thing is, the reason that the Federalists don't last very long is because this only made up a very small percentage of the population at that time. The United States was about 94% rural at this time. So certainly, out in rural areas, Jefferson's party tended to be much more popular in these rural agrarian areas. Now, as far as government involvement in the economy, Hamilton believed that the government should be something that could be used to stimulate the economy, basically to promote the development of a manufacturing sector. That's really, Hamilton's big thing is the promotion of a manufacturing sector. At this time, the economy was overwhelmingly agricultural. And so then with Jefferson is saying, we don't want government involvement in the economy, that Jefferson was a laissez-faire guy, that the economy should be, basically allowed to function on its own. And so, of course, that also worked to the advantage of people who were in agriculture, who didn't necessarily need supports like a national bank. Okay. So as far as that goes, Jefferson was emphatically against the bank as much as Hamilton was emphatically for it. Now, then we go on to the protective tariff. Okay. Now, this is something that doesn't immediately become an issue. Hamilton wanted a protective tariff in order to promote a manufacturing sector, whereas Jefferson believed that the tariff should be collected for revenue only. Now, of course, this is going to be a recurring issue that we're going to see in, United States politics for quite a while, even all the way through the Gilded Age, where you have, very high tariffs for several decades. But the Jeffersonian farmers, this didn't really work out to their benefit. But Hamilton felt like a protective tariff in order to nurture American industry, okay, basically to promote a manufacturing sector, that would be something that would be advantageous. And then the federal assumption of state war debts, okay, so the states had contracted a lot of individual debts during the American Revolution. And Hamilton believed that, we should assume these state war debts. And one thing that you look at here, when you look at all of this stuff that's kind of playing together, is that, by assuming the war debts of the states and by making the Revolutionary War debt a federal matter, something that we all share, then, this is something that is going to be helpful, okay, in bringing about a stronger central government, making the people of the several states closer to each other. Whereas for Jefferson, this is something that is not going to, that's not going to, further his goals of promoting the rights of the states and promoting a very limited central government. Jefferson would rather the states be responsible for their own debts from the war. So, of course, that's going to be, settled later on with the dinner table compromise. Now, in terms of foreign policy, which we'll focus on next time, that we see that the Federalists tended to be Anglophiles, okay? They were fans of the British, okay? Whereas the Jeffersonians were Francophiles. The biggest foreign policy issue at this time was the French Revolution, okay? So there's this revolution going on in France, and a lot of folks are skeptical about it, especially the Federalists. They look at France and what's going on there, they see chaos. Whereas, Jefferson and Madison, they're not necessarily thinking in terms of it's an ideal situation, but at least the French have established a republic. They've established a republican form of government. And for Jefferson, he believed that supporting France, now maybe not trying to send an army over there, but giving some kind of support for France as a sister republic was very important for the United States and for the maintenance of a republican form of government here. And so as far as that, we want to note that the first two-party system ended after the War of 1812. Remember, you had that little meeting, the Hartford Convention, where New England Federalists, who had once believed in a strong central government, they believed that the government under Madison had become too strong. By that time, Madison was the president of the United States. Jefferson had already done his 2 terms. And so from there, the Hartford Convention, which had made an implicit threat to consider secession if if the constitutional amendments they were recommending were not acted upon. So with that, we see that there is the end of the Federalist Party, and 1816 is going to be the last time that the Federalist Party puts up somebody, a serious candidate for the presidency. And that, of course, leads to the era of good feeling. All right, you are welcome, more than welcome to check out my website and YouTube channel, and also want to make sure that you take advantage of an opportunity from the Bill of Rights Institute, okay? The Bill of Rights Institute is doing this We the Students Scholarship Essay Contest, okay? So as far as that goes, up to 19,000 in prizes. Now, I was looking at the prizes. The first prize for this essay contest is $7,500, $7,500. I mean, you're in quarantine right now. What else do you have to do, right? And this is something that could be really good for preparing for the AP US History exam as well. There are several $1,500 prizes as well. The essay question is, what does civil discourse mean to you? And for more information there, you can go to wethestudents.org. Okay, this is a project of the Bill of Rights Institute. And with that, let's go ahead and take a look there. Oh, the essay is to be 500 to 800 words, so it's really not even that long of an essay. If you think about like 750 words, $7,500, that's like basically $10 per word that you could get paid. That's really not bad at all. Okay, so Hamilton, like when we think about the federal assumption of state debts, that Hamilton is saying that he wants the federal government to take over the state war debts. Now, remember that this is part of his overall goal in putting together a stronger central government, okay? And so as far as that goes, that is Hamilton's view. Now, where that is, where they end up making the compromise there, this is something that they call the dinner table compromise. And this is where Madison sets up a dinner meeting between Jefferson and Hamilton. And so they go over this, and what Hamilton says, now remember that the federal capital was initially at New York, then it moved to Philadelphia. And from there, well, it was going to move to Philadelphia, but where was it going to go? Now, when you look at New York and Philadelphia, These are both major cities. Okay, so at first, the federal government is meeting in New York. Now, what is New York most famous for today? A lot of things, but economically, the New York Stock Exchange. Like, this is basically the center of the stock market. And this is something worth noting here, that when we think about a stock market and we think about, quote unquote, capitalism, okay, like the whole idea of an economy that is based on money, okay, and the circulation of money and investment. Now, as far as that goes, somebody like Jefferson, this idea that Jefferson, and Madison were more attached to is that, that the economy is based on land, okay, that they were wealthy because of their land and what their land produced. And so when you look at Hamilton, that people who supported Hamilton were ready because, people who supported Hamilton were ready because they were, or wait, sorry, I saw a question come up, and yeah, they were wealthy. Sorry, not ready, but they were wealthy, or ready to be wealthy maybe, because of the stock exchange and because they have money and because of their investments. And so we see two different things happening here. And so Hamilton, what we want to note about Hamilton is his report on the public credit. Okay, so what Hamilton wanted to do is, his job was to build up public credit, which the thing is, in order to build credit, which those of you who are in high school, which all of you are, right? Unless you're just watching this for fun, in that case, you're welcome to be here. But, when we look at, building credit on an individual level, you have to get into debt in order to build credit. Like, there are people who will tell you, like, for example, if you were going to buy a car, there are people who would tell you that it would be better to have bad credit than no credit, because at least if you have bad credit, there's a credit history and people know what they're dealing with. So, I actually, fun fact, I sold cars for about 6 weeks right after I got out of college, because the local job market wasn't that great. And, when you're dealing with someone's credit history, it may be less than spectacular, but you can see at least how likely is this person to pay me back. And so when somebody has no credit, then they're not, then they don't have any kind of way of knowing. So you're not going to be able to just walk in and get a car with no credit, much less a house. So in order to do that, in order to build credit, you've got to borrow money and pay it back. And so Hamilton's job as Treasury Secretary is to build public credit. And so when we think about building public credit, what's the best way to build public credit? Well, it is to get into debt and then to pay down that debt. So Hamilton says we need to take over the debts from the states, and that way it will build public credit. Now, the same way that Hamilton said that Revolutionary War debts were going to be paid at face value. Now, by face value, what Hamilton's saying is that he wanted to pay like exactly the amount that was owed. Now, the issue was that a lot of Continental Army veterans who were owed money for their services in the Revolutionary War, they had given their, there'd been all of these panics in the mid 1780s during the articles, and they had actually sold their, their war debts to speculators. Okay, now speculators, these are people who are going to come out and they see that there is a way to buy things cheap, to buy commodities cheap. So for right now, for example, there are people that are speculating in the stock market. I mean, I actually started an E-Trade account last week because I was wondering, like, hey, it looks like this would actually be a good time to get involved in the stock market, because we're pretty sure that it's going to go up from here. So with that, I mean, nobody's projecting that everybody's going to die or anything like that. So, as far as, we're not looking at a true apocalyptic situation. We're looking at a situation where we're having to isolate ourselves in order to slow the process, the progress of something that would otherwise clog up the medical system. So a lot of people right now are speculating in the stock market. Well, people did a similar thing with the Revolutionary War debt, that they went to these Continental Army veterans and they went and bought up the war debt at 25 cents on the dollar. Basically, like, let's say that this was a $1,000 certificate, and the speculator comes in and says, you know what? I will pay you $250, a bird in the hand. is worth 2 in the bush, or in this case, 4 in the bush. And the Continental Army veteran who doesn't have a lot of money saved up, he says, okay, I mean, my family needs to eat, go ahead and take it. Now, the thing is, Hamilton says we're trying to build public credit. And so we're going to pay back these debts at face value. And by face value, what we're talking about here is he says we're going to pay $1,000. And we're going to pay it to the people who are holding the debt right now. So the Continental Army veteran who gave away, who practically gave away his debt certificate at 25 cents on the dollar, it's gone. Okay. So as far as that goes, but as far as that goes, think about this, that you can understand where Jefferson and Madison are coming from, that like these should go, if we're going to pay them back face value, they should go to the original holders and not the speculators. But that's not how you build credit. You build credit by saying, like, we will recognize legitimate financial transactions that are legitimate and voluntary, and that we are going to we're going to recognize those transactions and we're going to pay it back at face value. So from a credit building perspective, Hamilton's right. Even though from a fairness perspective, I think you can kind of see why Jefferson and Madison were not crazy about this idea. But again, Hamilton's job is to build public credit. And to do that, you've got to borrow money and you've got to pay back every cent of what you owe when it's due. Now, somebody's asking, will I get my time extension for the online exam? I would think so, but at the same time, what I think that is important is, get in touch with your AP coordinator, with your school's AP coordinator. Make sure to ask that question, because I don't know, whether that sounds like something that would go between the College Board and AP coordinator. So if you are entitled to some sort of additional time, make sure that you are, getting in touch with your AP coordinator on that. Okay, so with that, let's see, are there any other questions here? We can focus on some things here and go from there. But go ahead and be sure to ask questions as you have them. And for right now, let me go ahead and think about this, because when we're talking about Jefferson and the Constitution, I think it's important also to go into the issue with the Louisiana Purchase. Now, of course, this is how, depending on how you interpret it. But when it comes down to it, Jefferson was criticized, okay, by Federalists when it came time for the Louisiana Purchase. And this is where Jefferson's almost victim of his own inflexibility, because, Jefferson had basically said that he does not believe in the doctrine of implied powers in the 1790s, like the doctrine of implied powers, this idea that, you can have a loose construction of the Constitution and the Constitution is a guideline. That's something that Jefferson didn't buy into. So speaking of buying things, when Jefferson had an opportunity to buy Louisiana, that from the French, he wanted to buy Louisiana. You can have this, 3 cents an acre, for all of this land from France that can become farmland. Well, Jefferson goes ahead and buys it. Now, Jefferson had some misgivings, because Jefferson was so, Jefferson was so like adamant about it being in the Constitution. He wanted to add something to the Constitution that would specifically authorize the federal government to purchase land, because there was nothing in the Constitution that specifically authorized the federal government to purchase land. And so Jefferson wanted that to be added, essentially, wanted to add that to the Constitution. Now, the problem is that the constitutional amendment process, it's very demanding, that you have to have 2/3 of both houses of Congress. And on top of that, you have to have 3/4 of the states. And that just was not going to happen, because what's happening with the Louisiana Purchase, we want to appreciate it on a political level, in the sense that when the nation is expanding south and west, then the influence of New England is going to be less and less and less. Okay. So with that, let me go ahead and show y'all kind of why people in the Northeast were not, were not in the, let's see. So thanks. Okay. Glad to give the input if that was to me. Yeah, we can certainly get into the Whiskey Rebellion in a bit. I think that that's important. I've got a video on that one. Let's see. Election of 1800. Okay, so let's look at the election of 1800, the election where Jefferson became president. Okay, so we'll note here that, the Northeast, they were not supportive of the Louisiana Purchase. And we can see why when we look here, because you look here and the farther south, the farther west, that the United States expands, you see that Jefferson's party is becoming more and more dominant here. Okay, so now New York is with the Jeffersonians at that time because the alliance they made with Aaron Burr, which was going to get to get shaky after a bit. But you can see here at this time, New England was very staunchly Federalist. Now, also you can see here where you've got New Jersey and Delaware, which are both states. What New Jersey and Delaware have in common, which makes them very ripe for being Federalist states, is that they are not, that they don't have a frontier. Okay, so the farther you go on the frontier, the more sympathy you're going to find with the Jeffersonians, the farther you go on the frontier. And so with the Louisiana Purchase, it's basically like these people out here are not going to vote for the Federalist Party. It's just not going to happen. And so politically, Jefferson purchasing Louisiana was going to be a big win for his party. So what you see here is when you look at these states in the Northeast that are voting Federalist, if Jefferson had tried to get a constitutional amendment passed, then that just was not going to fly. And so going from there, that Jefferson, in purchasing Louisiana, some people say that Jefferson was giving in to the doctrine of implied powers. Now, I would say that that would be a minor concession at best. Okay, it'd be a minor concession at best. So going from there, okay, so let's think about what questions are common for this time frame on the test. Now, Molly, what we're going to have to note here is we are in a situation where we don't know. Okay, like this exam, like I've always said that, AP exams, ever since they've gone to the stimulus-based multiple choice, there are only a certain amount of topics that can really be assessed in any given year. The old exam used to have 80 questions on a variety of topics. And so when you look at the old exam, it was more comprehensive. This exam is already, as it is, if we were taking the full exam, was not totally comprehensive. And when you look at the exam y'all are going to take this year, a 45-minute exam, we have no idea what's going to be on the test. Now, we could go through the whole course and exam description, but I wouldn't try to play an odds game here. That you want to have as good of an understanding of the period as you can. Now, I would say that the most important things here, if you know nothing else, are thinking in terms of contrasting the Federalists with the Jeffersonian Republicans. That's something that's going to be important. That's going to be, I think, the most important thing during this period. You want to understand the conflict over the National Bank. Then we want to see Washington's farewell address, and then the controversy dealing with the Alien and Sedition Acts, and the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions. As a result of that, basically this fight over states' rights versus the power of the federal government. When the Alien and Sedition Acts, like especially the Sedition Act, went directly counter to the First Amendment, where Congress shall make no law, respecting the freedom of speech or of the press. And so the Alien and Sedition Acts, did so. This is where the federal government seized a power that was not, given to it by the Constitution. And so with that, I think that those are probably going to be your most important things there in this time frame. Now, how would we contextualize Jefferson's presidency? Now, if we're looking at something that's on Jefferson's presidency, for example, like let's say that we were looking at Jefferson's presidency and that, we want to talk about the Louisiana Purchase, maybe the Embargo Act. Like when you think about it, nobody would say that the Embargo Act was unconstitutional per se, that this is something that cannot, that was not in the Constitution. I mean, certainly we see that the federal government has the power to regulate trade with foreign nations. And so when you look at the Embargo Act, though, I wouldn't say that Jefferson's doing something unconstitutional, but he is doing something that is a very like heavy-handed application of government power. So for example, when we think about this, think about for right now, like I've actually compared, I mean, for, President Trump said that basically we're not going to allow like people, flights from Europe, like unless it's an American citizen or permanent resident trying to get back into the United States, that we are not going to be allowing people from Europe to fly into the United States. And so that's something that was a very heavy-handed use of presidential power. Now, you may agree with that use of presidential power, but it's still something that for a guy that was, really into limited government, for example, okay, when we think about somebody who is for limiting the Constitution, basically the federal government's powers under the Constitution, what we have to think about here is that, this is something that is, it definitely doesn't seem to quite go along with what Jefferson was talking about in the 1790s when he was like, look, that, we want the federal government to be very small and limited in power. So when we're thinking about contextualization, if we want to get into the embargo, if we want to get into, I want to like blow out your ears by screaming like that. Oh, this cursor don't grab me, but I'm not going to like blow out your, some of y'all might have headphones on or something like that. But y'all know that cartoon where the guy's like getting bit by the snapping turtle and, he yells out, oh, this cursor don't grab me. Okay, so let's see, the Embargo Act. So the Embargo Act, I think, is pretty similar because the Embargo Act just said essentially that we are cutting off trade with everybody for a while, okay? Like cutting off trade with everybody for a bit. And so that's something, let's go ahead and take a quick look here at this cartoon. It's one of my favorite cartoons, okay? Oh, this cursed oh grab me. And so, there's this guy, basically, we assume he's trying to smuggle something out, darn it, how he nicks them. Oh, this cursed oh grab me. And there is the embargo portrayed as a snapping turtle, okay? And so you see the British flag over there in the distance. You see some people, that are going to row out to it. And so we see here that there are people smuggling during the embargo. But the embargo is something like Jefferson's own Treasury Secretary, Albert Gallatin. He was, he advised Jefferson, don't do this. This is not a good idea. Basically, he said that in my view, the heavy use of government power is not something that is going to be good. Okay, like the heavy use of government power is never going to result in something good. So yeah, the embargo is seen like where the Louisiana Purchase would be seen as like the greatest success of Jefferson's presidency. Then when we look at the the Louisiana Purchase is success, the embargo, something that is seen as a failure. And it wasn't accepted well, especially in New England. Now, when you think about this, I mean, we've got something that's very relatable right now with this travel ban. Now, we could say that, like, look, that there is a lot of, we've got a lot of coronavirus cases in Europe, and we're just going to have to kind of tone that down, right? That preventing travel from Europe is going to, it's going to bring this virus over here faster. We're going to have to slow down travel. Now, you see what's happened with the stock market, okay? That, basically, as far as this whole, corona crisis, like if we were to look at the Dow, 6 months, okay, let's go ahead and take a look at the Dow. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and put this on my screen again here. And let's see here, looking for the, oh, there it is. Okay, I was looking for the Zoom window here. All right, so there it is. It was hiding out in the corner. Okay, and so let me go ahead and share my screen with you because I think this is a very applicable thing. Okay, we've got something that we can go into. Why wasn't the embargo more popular? And so if we think about this, that when we look at the year to date, okay, so basically President Trump, had this announced this travel ban from Europe. Now, what day? Let's see. When did Trump announce? Let's see. I'm teaching right now, so I'd probably say President Trump, right? President Trump announce the Europe travel ban. Okay, so if we look at the date, okay, so what do we need to know about Trump's European travel ban? So about March 12th. Okay, so if we go here and we're to say like 1 month, okay, so going here, that we see here that this was Tuesday, March 10th. We see that the Dow was at 25,000. So then we see here that by March, when we look at the impact here, now it went way down here, okay, to like 18. So before this whole thing started, 27, the stock market, by Monday of this week, had lost about a third of its value. Airline stocks were even more than that. Like if we go to, Delta Airline stock, okay, so Delta stock, which it's back up to 31. So when you look here, that basically, looking at this, we're seeing that, so we'll say, let's look at a month ago. So Delta was at 48 a month ago. It had been in some cases as high as 62, and then it went as low as 21. Okay, so this was, this was on March 20th. So you see 21, and that's actually about when I bought a little bit of Delta stock last week. Not much, but I was just like, okay, I'm always telling my students, like whenever there's a panic like this, people are selling off, they're panicking, and this kind of goes into the Great Depression, that this is the time to buy. Okay, so whatever, even if you've just got a little bit of money lying around, if it's a 21, it used to be here. But the point being, okay, when we look at this, we want to look at the impact of this, so when we look at this, that basically Delta took a hit when the whole coronavirus thing started. But when President Trump made that announcement, we see that it took a big hit. So the economy is, the economy is suffering here. Now, at the same time, if you think about it, that, President Trump's decision may have saved a lot of lives. And when you think about Jefferson, what Jefferson was trying to do with the embargo, it wasn't, the Jeffersonian economic model was about trade. Okay, but what happens here with the embargo is that Jefferson is trying to keep us out of war. One thing we want to note here about Jefferson, when he takes over as president, that he had initially opposed Washington's neutrality proclamation. When Washington put out the neutrality proclamation and said that we are not going to take a position on the French Revolution, we're not going to support France, even in spirit, we are just going to stay out of it. Jefferson didn't support that. But what's interesting is when you look at, Jefferson as president from a different vantage point, from a different POV, right? When we think about point of view analysis, that Jefferson as Secretary of State did not support, the neutrality proclamation, but when Jefferson became president, this is something that's kind of, this separates the people who know stuff and the people who really know their stuff and the people who kind of know their stuff, is that a lot of people, they associate the phrase entangling alliances with George Washington. But actually, this was Jefferson in his first inaugural address. Jefferson said, peace, commerce, and honest friendship with all nations, entangling alliances with none. And so when I talk about, like next time when we'll talk about foreign policy, a lot of times I like to talk about the Washingtonian Jeffersonian foreign policy, not necessarily just the Washingtonian foreign policy, but Jefferson takes up, like when we think about like how revolutionary was the revolution of 1800, and when we look at this, that it's really in terms of foreign policy, Jefferson is trying to keep the United States out of war. So even though the embargo is something that was unpopular, some people might argue, I mean, he had good intentions, it might have been necessary. And then Jefferson, now of course this is his point of view, but Jefferson maintained after he was retired that the embargo would have worked if people had followed it, if people weren't so resistant to it. And so if we think about right now, what is the big thing right now? That basically the government's been telling people, social distancing, make sure not to get in large crowds and make sure to keep your distance. Try to stay at home as much as possible unless you are, having to go get necessary groceries or something like that. Well, what we see is a lot of people, they're not doing that. And so we think about this. I mean, the embargo has become like relevant today because of our situation. But when people are going out and mingling in large crowds, even though the government's telling them not to, it's making the government directive less effective than it would be if people were listening and saying, okay, well, you know what, social distancing guidelines, let's go ahead and do this. So that's something that, when you look at this current corona crisis, the government is having to take some measures that it normally would not take. Like, I've never seen anything like this in my lifetime. Okay. I've never seen anything like this in my lifetime. So we can understand why people didn't react well to the embargo. Just like, people are not necessarily reacting well to the current crisis. And so as far as that goes, let's see here. Y'all got, so, talking about stock market and the depression, all of that. Now, somebody said something about the whiskey rebellion. Okay, so let's go ahead and give a little bit of attention to the whiskey rebellion. Okay, so I'm going to run in here and I've got, okay, now note that I do have a video on the whiskey rebellion where I'm going through. This was actually a screencast I did a few years ago. So as far as that, let's see. All right. The chat is okay. Now here's the thing. Those of you who are here, the chat is on the depression. I'm on the 1790s. Okay. So bruh, Hoover though, okay? Yeah, there was an A-Push class actually made this shirt a couple of springs ago, which, I really like. Yeah, so basically you see Hip Hughes and me. It was like Tom Solo and Hugh Bacca. And so this is when the Solo movie was coming out. So yeah, that was an A-Push class. Made that for me a few years ago, Miss Betts' class. So as far as that goes, let's try to keep the chat. I love that you're actually talking about U.S. history, but if you're talking about the Depression, you're not really getting out of it what we've got here. So, but I do like that y'all are talking about history. So with that, let me just show y'all a bit about the Whiskey Rebellion. Now, this is one of those episodes in the first two-party system, okay? And so as far as that goes, the federal assumption of state debts, and that happens. Now, Hamilton then, one of the things Hamilton wanted to do was assume state debts. Another thing Hamilton wanted to do to try to build public credit and to create revenue for the federal government is he proposed a whiskey tax, and Congress actually passed this excise tax on whiskey. Now, an excise tax is a tax that is collected for the sale or manufacture of something. Okay, so the excise tax on whiskey is passed, which means that the manufacture of whiskey is going to be taxed. So this is a tax on products sold or produced for sale. Now, this could also be considered a sin tax. Now, there's a word, sin tax, but that's not what this is. S-Y-N-T-A-X. A sin tax is like when we put a tax on alcohol, or a tax on cigarettes, or something like that. A tax on luxury. But what we want to note here is, now none of y'all are old enough to drink, but people who are old enough to drink, whiskey is seen as a luxury. something to be enjoyed by gentlemen. Now, also, you know, ladies of good taste, you know, we want to make sure we're in the 20th century here, right? And the thing is that it used to be a poor man's drink. Okay, Jefferson actually wrote some very interesting things about whiskey, where he says here that you know, that he just did not like whiskey and people who drank it. It's very interesting stuff by Jefferson. So Jefferson wanted to make, you know, Jefferson was not a fan of excise taxes. He wanted wine to become a more prominent drink. He felt like whiskey. He said he'd have a hard time voting for somebody who was a whiskey drinker. So he probably wouldn't have been a big fan of Henry Clay, especially since Henry Clay was for, you know, the American system, which definitely wasn't Jeffersonian, national bank internal improvements and protective tariffs. So Jefferson and Henry Clay definitely would not have gotten along. And so Hamilton's tax was not popular in Appalachia, okay, this area with Western frontier settlers, because whiskey was basically a side hustle where these frontier farmers would distill their excess grain into whiskey. And now Hamilton wants to tax them. And, you know, because back in these backwoods areas, whiskey was something of a currency. People would trade bottles of whiskey in lieu of trading coinage and money, like a, you know, like a barter system. And so people in Appalachia felt like that they were targeted, and these were Western farmers who were prone to support Jefferson. Now, another thing here is that Hamilton's whiskey tax was set up that small distillers would pay by the gallon, whereas large distillers got to pay a flat rate. So they were able to just to pay this flat rate so that they didn't have to, you know, in paying the flat rate, they didn't have to pay as much per capita, which guess who the largest distiller in the country was at that time? Does anybody know? The biggest distiller in the United States at that time was George Washington. And actually, if you visit Mount Vernon, that if you visit Mount Vernon, one of the things that you can see is, you know, they have basically put Washington's distillery back together so that people can go look at it. So this was a regressive tax. Basically, the poor would pay a greater percentage than the rich. And so, yeah, that's where I've got this. America's largest distiller was George Washington. And so with that, there is a rebellion that comes from that in Western Pennsylvania. Okay, so when we look at Western Pennsylvania, you know, this area is, you know, is still, you know, got its own distinct character. Now, what we want to note here is this is like the last of the frontier settler rebellions. Okay, so there are 3 frontier settler rebellions in early U.S. history: Bacon's Rebellion, which is an episode in colonial Virginia; Shays' Rebellion, which is in Western Massachusetts, and remember that's a causal factor for the Constitution; and then the Whiskey Rebellion, okay, is this third of 3 frontier settler rebellions. And so the Whiskey Rebellion happened in Pennsylvania. Western Pennsylvania farmers, they were protesting Hamilton's whiskey tax. And what we see here is, at least in the short term, federal power is demonstrated here. Whereas Shays' Rebellion went on for months, the Whiskey Rebellion was put down rather quickly. And so you see frontier farmers versus Eastern elites. And so as far as that goes, you know, just going into this, I mean, there, you know, you can look at some of this stuff in my, you know, in my lecture, but Washington calls out the militia, brings in about 13,000 troops. Now, it's said sometimes that Washington actually led the troops. He didn't actually lead them, you know, he didn't actually lead them, you know, into the engagement, which by the time they got there, the rebels had scattered, but he inspected the troops at a certain point here, but didn't actually lead them. Okay, so technically maybe that it was actually, you know, Robert E. Lee's father, Light Horse Harry Lee, who was in command and, you know, returned to Philadelphia afterwards. You know, he was the father of General Robert E. Lee. And so, yeah, basically nobody was there. When the federal militia got there, the rebels had dispersed because they heard, like, you know, we got a force of 13,000 coming over here. Now, Hamilton gets a short-term victory out of this. The federal government demonstrated its ability to put down violent insurrections. And also note here that Washington pardoned 2 men, who were found guilty of treason in federal court and sentenced to hang. Washington was, and this is actually kind of taking Jefferson's advice about Shays' Rebellion, that be lenient in the way that these people are punished. So, they were sentenced to hang. Washington said, let's go ahead and pardon them. But at the same time, the point had been made that federal power had been exhibited. And you don't see these small, rebellions start in the corner of a state anymore. And so Jefferson believed that, this was something of an overreaction. He said an insurrection was announced and proclaimed and armed against, but could never be found. And so Jefferson, was very firm in his belief that, basically Hamilton and Washington had assembled a large force just to prove a point. And this is something that, we don't see these frontier settler rebellions, happen after this. But perhaps a syntax error. Ha, 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 ha. You see what I did there? A real knee slapper. And so the Whiskey Rebellion was put down, but voters in Western Pennsylvania remained very hostile to Hamilton's Federalist Party, leading to its loss of political power a few years later. So we want to note here that in the long term, Jefferson's the one that becomes president, and Jefferson repealed Hamilton's whiskey tax and actually repealed all internal excise taxes. And with that, Jefferson said in his second inaugural address, the remaining revenue of the consumption of foreign articles is paid cheerfully by those who can afford to add foreign luxuries to domestic comforts. So Jefferson believed that the tariff, a modest revenue tariff, should be the main mechanism of collecting money for the federal government, because it's paid by people who can afford luxuries. It may be the pleasure and pride of an American to ask, what farmer, what mechanic, what laborer ever sees a tax gatherer of the United States? And so with that, no Federalist president would ever be elected again after John Adams lost his bid for re-election in 1800. Now, John Quincy Adams would be elected after James Monroe, but basically we see here that the Virginia dynasty, you've got a quarter century of basically, Virginians governing for 8 years, and Jefferson and Madison each picked their hand-picked successor. So with that, we still have a debate over equitable taxation. And so with that, just to kind of note here, you're welcome to watch the lecture, but we want to make sure that, we do respect the time here, because it looks like we are going to run out soon. And let's see here. So we've got, looks like y'all are having a thing here. Yeah. So as far as that goes, this slideshow, very good. Like Molly has said here, if you just type in the Whiskey Rebellion into YouTube, you are going to be able to see where that is. And I've got the whole talk there, and I go into some more detail. Okay, so just understand that this is just went over the brass tacks here, but you can definitely go and look at the full show later. All right, so how are we doing? Any other last minute questions before we go? Now remember that the Bill of Rights Institute, if you go to wethestudents.org, this is a great, if I were in high school, I would be jumping at this opportunity. Okay, that is top prize is $7,500. That's nothing to shake a stick at. Okay, that is some good money right there. What does civil discourse mean to you? And of course, the Adams administration was another time, where civil discourse was kind of tough for some people. So with that, ladies and gentlemen, we are going to see you again on Tuesday for a foreign policy review. And so with that, I want to thank y'all and thank the Bill of Rights Institute for having me here. And it is always a pleasure, ladies and gentlemen.